June 6, 1944. Le Molay Littry, Normandy, France. General Dietrich Kraiss sat at a map table in a stone chateau that served as the headquarters of the 352 Infantry Division. The room smelled of coffee and damp paper. Telephones chattered in short bursts as signals officers tried to keep lines open through the night. At a little after 3 in the morning, he heard the first reports that the coast road from Vierville-sur-Mer toward Port-en-Bessin was filling with strange flashes. A duty officer said the sky to the west looked like a summer storm that never ended. At first light, runners came in from forward strongpoints with messages that sounded confused and urgent at the same time. Parachutes had fallen out of the darkness. Green and white lights floated down and drifted into hedgerows. Some landed in orchards and on church roofs. A sergeant at a coastal battery west of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer reported men shouting in English beyond the wire. Kraiss felt the familiar tug between habit and disbelief. He had heard officers in the past say the Americans would not stand in a long fight in bad weather. He had heard that they were strong in machines and weak in spirit. Yet a miner's instinct from his youth in Hesse had stayed with him through many campaigns, and it told him that men who crossed cold water at night from a far shore were not lacking in courage. When the sun lifted a pale band over the fields, he walked to the window and saw a thin smear of smoke on the horizon and the outline of ships that looked like a city at sea. The map pins before him showed his regiments spread thin. The 916 Regiment held positions near Saint-Laurent and Colville-sur-Mer. The 914 and 915 regiments had parts inland and parts facing the coast. The 352 artillery batteries sat on reverse slopes behind the coastal belt that had been laid out by Rommel, with beach obstacles, mines, and nests of machine guns in concrete. He ordered the forward battalions to hold until armored support could be found. He told his chief of staff to get confirmation from Corps that mobile reserves were free to move. Then he tried to steady his voice on the telephone to a coastal company commander who reported that the sea was black with small craft and that men were climbing down nets into them from larger ships and boats, layer upon layer of motion. At 7 in the morning, he was told that American destroyers were closing the shore and firing point-blank into his strongpoints. At 8, he was told that a group of men had climbed the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc and were cutting phone lines. By 9, he learned that a battalion sector near Colville had lost contact and that the wire teams sent to find it had not returned. He had been taught to picture an enemy thrust like a spear. What he saw through his own reports looked more like a tide. It pressed at one place and then at another, and it kept coming. The broader canvas of that morning already stretched beyond the reach of any single headquarters. The Allies had launched the largest amphibious assault in modern history. In the night and early morning, more than 156,000 soldiers crossed the English Channel in an armada that used nearly 7,000 ships and landing craft, escorted and supported by fleets of cruisers and destroyers and corvettes, all under a sky where Allied air forces flew thousands of sorties to bomb roads, bridges, and batteries. American airborne forces of the 82nd and 101st Divisions, more than 13,000 paratroopers and glider infantry, had been dropped across the base of the Cotentin Peninsula to secure the causeways behind Utah Beach and to confuse and divide German reactions in the dark. At Omaha Beach, where the 1st United States Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, and the 29th United States Infantry Division landed, the plan assumed a rapid movement off the sand and up the draws. The plan met a defense that was far stronger than many Allied officers had expected, because the 352 Infantry Division had moved elements forward from inland positions to reinforce the static coastal division. The German coastal belt west of Bayeux was made up of strongpoints with names and numbers, with concrete casemates for guns, with interlocking machine gun fields of fire, with mortars registered on the exits, and with mines on the sand and in the water. The guns varied in caliber, with 75mm field pieces, 88mm guns used in direct fire, and captured pieces in concrete. Obstacle lines of wooden stakes and steel rails and hedgehogs stood in rows where the tide could carry a landing craft onto them and rip its bottom open. Allied bombardment in the early hours had missed many of the guns because a low ceiling and smoke concealed the targets, and because ships had to stay offshore in the swell. A storm with strong wind from the west had convinced German weather officers that no invasion could come on this day. It convinced Allied planners that German defense would relax enough to be surprised. As the American waves ran in, the first hours brought severe losses. Boats broached. Men stepped into water over their heads and drowned under heavy packs. At certain sectors, like the ones below Vierville and Saint Laurent, American assault companies met machine gun fire that scythed down ranks and pinned survivors behind obstacles. Even so, and this was the fact that would change many minds that day, small groups kept moving. They inched forward under fire, crawled past wire, blew gaps in the seawall, and climbed the bluffs. American naval officers took destroyers in close and fired into gun apertures at ranges where sailors could see the flash of their own shots on concrete. Rangers cut their way up cliffs with ropes and grenades. By midday on this one beach alone, the Americans had suffered thousands of casualties, a number often given as about 2,400 for the day. Yet by evening, they had a foothold, several kilometers deep in places, and held the high ground above Colville and Saint Laurent. To the east, at Gold, Juno, and Sword, British and Canadian forces were ashore in strength. To the west, at Utah, American reports showed a landing that had drifted off its marker, but had succeeded faster than expected through the marshes behind the beach. Erwin Rommel had warned that the first 24 hours would be decisive, and that if the defender could not destroy the invasion at the waterline, the battle would be lost in the long run. The first 24 hours had begun, and the events of this morning were already setting their shape. Near noon in Le Molay Littry, the general walked from the map table to a field telephone that had been carried into the courtyard to get a line clear of echoes. The sun lit the wet leaves and made the air smell like cut grass. He spoke with a battalion commander who was still in contact on the western edge of the American landing. The voice on the other end was calm at first, and then began to slip into a strained rhythm. The battalion had held a strong point with 2 machine guns, a light field gun, and a mortar. It had fired until barrels glowed and then moved to a secondary trench under a shrapnel rain from naval shells. The first attack had been repulsed, the second had reached the wire, and the third had found a gap at a shallow draw with reed grass and wet sand. Shoreward, the general's staff listened to an inland battery that reported the sea moving under gunfire like a pot on a boil. Forward observers said the enemy kept bringing more craft through smoke screens. Kraiss wrote times and short notes with a pencil that scratched the paper. He sent the 915 Regiment toward the coast to counterattack. He asked Corps to confirm the release of armored support. He was told that panzer divisions remained under higher command and could not be committed without authority from above. He learned that Field Marshal Rommel was away in Germany, that Field Marshal von Rundstedt had asked for the armored reserve, and that the decision lay with the very top. It was late morning before permission came for limited moves. The nearest armor that could strike in strength was the 21st Panzer Division east of the Orne, which had to cross ground under Allied air control. The 12th SS Division and Panzerlehr were farther back. Meanwhile, the ground in front of him was turning into a study in persistence. Reports reached his table from a strong point near St. Laurent that said a group of Americans had crawled up a shallow wash and were now behind the wire. Another report said a naval gun had knocked a concrete casemate out of action with a single direct hit through the aperture. A runner who had crossed 2 kilometers of hedgerow country said the American destroyers stood so close in the surf that he could see sailors running along decks as they fired. The general pressed his lips and tried not to let his staff hear his breath quicken. He had seen hard fights before. He had seen enemy attacks falter because the men in them lost heart. He searched for that sign and could not find it. Instead, he found small patrols that took a fold of ground and then another, found officers who gathered fragments of companies and pushed them through brambles and up slopes that looked unclimbable with a pack and a rifle. He found that when a machine gun burst, cut men down at a gap in the seawall, more men moved into the same gap a few minutes later. He felt something that many German officers felt that day when they watched the same thing with their own eyes. It was the collapse of an old story. The old story had said that the American soldier would turn back if blood started to run on open ground. The new story took shape in a single morning under the cliffs. It said that he would keep coming. The wider frame of the day filled in around that change in perception. Allied airborne units that had landed in the dark were scattered by wind, yet they blocked many roads and seized bridges that mattered. At Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers of the 82nd Division secured the first town in Normandy under American control. At Chef du Pont and La Fière, they fought to hold a causeway over flooded fields while German counterattacks pressed them with mortars and machine guns. Farther east, near Ranville, British paratroopers held the bridges over the Orne and the Caen Canal, anchoring the left edge of the Allied line. At sea, more than 1,000 warships and support craft kept up fire missions all day. Allied air power flew thousands of sorties to strike batteries, columns, and road junctions, so that German units moving by road under daylight were cut to pieces or stopped in their tracks. The German command system that had been built like a hard shell for set-piece defense now had to shift rapidly to meet blows at many points. The reality was that armored divisions could not move early and fast without permission and freedom of action. The permission took time to come. The freedom of action did not exist under the eyes of Allied pilots, who ranged the skies and under a navy that could lift an entire wall of fire along any line of advance that came near the coast. The 21st Panzer Division did move in the afternoon east of the Orne and made a thrust toward the sea that reached British lines near the mouth of the river, but larger coordinated armored attacks from farther inland would not arrive in force for this first day. By evening on the American beaches there were companies from the 1st Division and the 29th Division on the high ground beyond the shingle. Engineers were clearing the exits. Bulldozers were pushing through wrecks and sand. The number of men ashore kept rising every hour. The figures that are used for the day give a sense of the scale. More than 156,000 Allied soldiers came over on the first day, supported by thousands of vehicles and thousands of tons of supplies that would grow in number by the end of the first week to a stream that could not be stopped. In the headquarters at Le Molay Littry, the general set his jaw and listened to his artillery commander describe ammunition stocks and barrel wear. He asked for casualty figures and got only fragments. He stood with his chief of staff at the gate as the evening settled and heard the rumble of guns out toward the coast and the mutter of aircraft passing inland. He thought of an earlier time when many around him had laughed about soft soldiers from across the ocean. He thought of the cold men on the beach, who had kept moving through the morning into the afternoon, and of the sailor who had brought his destroyer close enough to put shells through a concrete gun mouth. That night, he wrote a short line in his log that recorded the facts he could prove. The landing had come at Omaha and Utah in strength. Airborne units had disrupted roads. Naval gunfire had neutralized many positions. The division had committed reserves and would commit more. He did not write the one fact that shaped his thoughts as he closed the book on the table. It lived behind his eyes and did not need ink. Whatever he had heard at card tables or smoke-filled rooms about Americans before this day no longer mattered. When the light came back in the early hours, he would meet them again, and he would treat them as an enemy who had earned respect. The night of June 6th slipped into the early hours of June 7th, and General Dietrich Kraiss walked the dark corridor of the chateau with the stub of a pencil in his hand and a fatigue that felt like gravel under the skin. He stepped outside into a wet breeze and listened for the coast. The rumble had a slow rhythm that thickened and thinned as if the sea itself breathed in gunfire. A signals officer brought him a handset and cupped the mouthpiece to shield it from the wind. A company commander speaking from the heights above St. Laurent reported that American patrols were now on the upper slopes in several places, that snipers were active in scrub on the bluffs, and that engineers were clearing the beach obstacles under the cover of smoke screens from destroyers that kept edging in close with the tide. The voice said that a bunker had been hit through its gun port, and that the crew inside had been killed by a single shell that came as straight as a thrown spear. Kraiss asked for ammunition counts and water levels, and was told they were still manageable if resupply could move behind the lines by farm lane and hedgerow. He ordered the men to hold every terrace and sunken lane that could anchor a line, to lay new mines at the foot of draws that the Americans favored, and to move machine guns to fresh angles as soon as the barrels cooled. He kept his tone even. He had learned in years of service that a voice could hold men in place when the ground seemed to push them back. When he returned to the map room, he traced with a finger the path of the Powerhouse 915 Regiment that had been sent to counterattack in the late morning and early afternoon on June 6th. The counterattack had struck fragments of American units probing for the roads off the beach and had inflicted losses, yet it had not driven the enemy back to the water. Instead, the fight had broken into small, violent knots among hedges and folds that were not shown on any staff map. He told his chief of operations to prepare another thrust at first light with whatever could be gathered, and he asked for the latest word from Corps on armored support. The answer came back with the same dead weight as the day before. Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS were still forming for movement and would not be at hand quickly. The general set the handset down and looked at a clock that insisted it was only 3. He knew by feel that the dawn would come cold and gray, and that the first sound he would hear would be the short hammer of machine guns from the direction of the coast road. By the morning of June 7th, the wider line of battle around him had shifted in ways that any veteran could read even without a map. Allied shipping filled the horizon from Grand Camp to beyond Courseulles, a city of steel and mastheads that did not recede with the tide. The beach that the Americans called Omaha had taken a terrible harvest in the first hours of the previous day. Yet by late June 6th and into the night, engineers had cleared exits and bulldozers had pushed through wrecks, so that by dawn on June 7th streams of vehicles began to move up the draws and into the bocage. The numbers rose with each tide. Within the first 2 days at Omaha and Utah, the Americans landed many tens of thousands of men, as well as thousands of vehicles, guns, and tons of supplies in a flow that could be measured by the hour. To the east The British and Canadians had secured large lodgements at Gold, Juno, and Sword, and were pushing toward Bayeux and Caen. Allied air power continued to fly thousands of sorties to strike batteries, columns, and crossroads, so that any German unit that tried to move by daylight on an open road risked being broken by bombs and rockets within minutes. Allied naval guns ranged the coastal belt with spotters who corrected fire at short intervals. The German command system faced the fact that formations designed to wait behind a permanent belt and counterattack on order could not move freely when the sky belonged to the enemy. In this frame, the 352 Infantry Division held ground that mattered because the high land above Omaha controlled the routes inland. The division's regiments, the 914, the 915, and the 916, had already taken heavy losses. Some companies had been pushed back from concrete bunkers to field positions with little more than foxholes and a few spools of wire. Yet in many places, the men still held hedges, orchards, and lanes where the slopes favored a defender who knew the ground. Reports filed by staff officers in the afternoon showed that the division had stopped certain thrusts and had forced the Americans to turn flanks rather than drive straight through. For the men in the forward companies, the day did not feel like a line on a chart. It felt like the close scrape of a shovel on wet earth as they dug another firing position with hands that would not stop shaking, like the sound of a nearby mortar that coughed without warning, like the sight of an American patrol that appeared at the turn of a hedgerow and did not withdraw when confronted with fire. An infantryman told a runner that the enemy came in small groups with leaders who waved them forward, and that when one leader fell, another took his place. In Molay Littry, Kraiss read these fragments and no longer searched the words for softness or bravado. He accepted them as the plain account of a hard opponent. He ate a dry piece of bread with a cup of black coffee at a table that had once held a family's supper and bent over a message that cited the name of a town he knew well, Formigny, a few kilometers inland from St. Laurent. The note said that American patrols were probing toward it, and that units from the 916 Regiment had established positions along the shallow ridge to deny the road net that ran through the village. He ordered a battalion from the 915 Regiment to support the ridge and to use local guides to thread through the orchards south of the highway, and he told the artillery to register on the lanes that led up from Colville. He then crossed the courtyard, stepped into a car, and rode out with a small escort to a forward command point. The road smelled of crushed leaves and petrol. At a bend near an old stone cross, the driver slowed for a crater and a cart that had overturned. A woman stood by the ditch holding a child and looking with that fixed French stare that did not judge, only observed and remembered. The general nodded to her and did not slow further. He knew that every minute on the road drew new attention from the sky. When he reached a company strongpoint in a hedged field with a view back toward the sea, he stood in a shallow trench and looked through field glasses. He could see the beach now as a strip of pale sand packed with wrecks and equipment and bodies. He could see men moving in files over the shingle and into the draws and then disappearing into the folds where the land rose in steps. Smoke drifted but no longer hid the scene. Farther out, he saw a row of large ships holding steady, and closer in, the shapes of smaller craft massing and dispersing in patterns that felt almost like breathing. He spoke with the company commander, a young officer with hollow eyes and a voice that was clear and calm. The officer said his men had fired until their machine gun barrels turned blue, had shifted positions twice, and had repelled 2 local charges by small groups of Americans who tried to slip along a drainage ditch. He added that the Americans were taking care of their wounded under fire and that engineers were marking the ground for more heavy equipment to come up. In that moment, the general felt again the quiet collapse of an old illusion. He remembered remarks in earlier years about men who would not press forward without music and hot meals. Here were men who kept coming with a steady will and with a discipline that did not shout but did not break. When he returned to the chateau, an intelligence officer placed on the table a translation of American radio traffic captured by monitoring units. The messages were terse. They asked for artillery on certain hedgerow corners and for engineers at named exits. They reported positions gained by yards, not by grand phrases. They sounded like mechanics discussing the repair of a damaged vehicle. The general pushed the paper back and said to no one in particular that the enemy had decided to win the beachhead as a craftsman wins a day, by patient work and steady grip, not by flourish. He then signed an order for the division to hold the line from the outskirts of Colleville through the ridge near Formigny to the sector facing Trèvières, and he circulated a plain instruction for company and battalion commanders to move their machine guns after every belt and their mortars after every 10 rounds, if a new covered position could be found within 50 paces. He knew that Allied spotters were learning every muzzle flash, and that survival would depend on movement measured in small acts. By the evening of June 7th, and into the morning of June 8th, the larger shape of the Normandy battle put new pressures on his sector. To the east, British forces were pressing toward Bayeux and the approaches to Caen. To the west, at Utah Beach, the Americans linked with airborne units and began a push to cut the Cotentin Peninsula. The Allied command had already begun to assemble the artificial harbors called mulberries off the British and American beaches. Concrete caissons and sunken ships formed protective arms that would allow the landing of many thousands of tons of supply each day, regardless of weather. A pipeline under the ocean would soon begin to carry petrol from England to the beachhead, though in this first week the flow of fuel still relied on steel drums and flexible hoses. Allied numbers, which had been staggering at dawn on June 6th, were now swelling by the hour. Within the first week, the Allied total of men ashore reached many hundreds of thousands, with tens of thousands of vehicles and a stream of ammunition and rations that rose into the tens of thousands of tons per day. German formations that might have counterattacked in the old way found that when they moved by road, they were scouted by fighter bombers and shelled by ships. When they moved by night, they still had to pass bridges and crossroads, watched by men with radios and lists of targets. The bocage favored defenders in small fields, but it punished large movements in daylight. Within this pressure, the 352 Infantry Division performed the task that fell to it, with stubborn energy. Its companies held hedgerows and drew blood from the American units that tried to force the road net inland. At places like the Our Valley and the approaches to Trèvières, German machine gunners used interlocking fire down sunken lanes that had banks thick with roots, and mortar rounds burst among orchard trees with a sound like wet timber snapping. Yet the numbers that told the longer story kept rising against them. The Americans brought up more infantry regiments and combat engineers who learned hedgerow fighting at a pace that turned hours into lessons. Commanders of American battalions on the right and center called for naval gunfire to do the work that artillery could not do quickly enough over soft ground, and destroyers again came in close to place heavy shells where observers told them to aim. In this setting, there were moments that showed character as clearly as any statistic. A captured American diary passed across the staff table at Le Molay Littry on June 8th with a short entry from the evening of June 6th that read, in steady script, that the writer had watched a man in the water pull another to the shingle and then stand up to wave a third forward before falling in the surf. Another note recorded a fragment of a speech by Brigadier General Norman Cotta on the morning of June 6, reported by a sergeant who had heard it at the seawall near Vierville. The words were simple and direct. "You cannot stay here. You can die here. You are going to advance because only by advancing can you survive." The staff passed the diary in silence. A young officer closed it and set it aside with a care one would give a fragile glass. Kraiss did not comment. He did not need to speak the thought that all of them understood now. What they faced was not a mob driven forward by noise and numbers. It was a large, trained, and determined enemy that combined careful method with stubborn will. On June 8th in the afternoon, a message arrived from a forward observer that the Americans had entered Trèves. There had been hard fighting in the streets and around the church, and the German garrison had pulled back to positions south of the town. The loss of that point on the map mattered because it opened routes toward the Auray and the Isigny sector, where the Americans sought to link Omaha with Utah. The general called his artillery commander and set new lines of fire along the roads to Rubersee and toward the heights west of the Drôme. He asked if ammunition stocks could sustain a night of heavy fire, and was told they could if supply could move under cover along hedged lanes. He approved the risk. Then he visited a medical dressing station, housed in a stone barn where orderlies worked by lamplight. He walked between cots and spoke briefly to men who watched him with the expression of those who measure a face to learn whether it tells the truth. He thanked a medic who had come from a village in Saxony and had a voice gone ragged from giving orders in a low tone through a long day. When he stepped back into the lane, he met an old man in a blue coat who held his hat in both hands and asked in careful German if the fighting would pass soon. The general answered in careful French that he did not know, and that the old man should keep his family in the cellar at night. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it lodged in his mind as he drove away. The land was full of people who had lived their lives in these parishes for centuries. Every decision he made wrote itself onto their kitchens and fields. He felt a stone in his chest at the thought, a weight that grew with each order he signed. Back at the chateau, a staff officer read from a captured Allied leaflet that had been dropped over forward positions that day. It stated in plain terms that the Allies had come back to France to break the rule of the occupier, that civilian lives were valued, and that the army that came ashore was strong enough to stay. The leaflet names and phrases were simple and without flourish. They painted an opponent who believed his case and did not look as if he would break off this work. As the day closed on June 8th and opened on June 9th, the operational picture enlarged to include the first Allied attempts to push toward the line of the Vire and the lower Aure, while British forces prepared new efforts toward Caen. The German High Command tried to bring forward reserves that could check these movements. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division began to arrive east of Caen and would soon counterattack against the Canadians. Panzer Lehr moved up from the south, but was slowed by air attack and destroyed bridges. The 2nd Panzer Division and the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division were also coming from deeper in France. The sum of these moves promised hard fighting in the days ahead. Yet for the 352 Infantry Division, the fight remained immediate and close. Its forward battalions fought blind corners in the bocage. Every field a room with walls of earth and root. Every turn of a lane a new ambush. Losses mounted. Company strength fell from full tables to ragged lists that showed half the men or fewer. The division diary recorded that the men remained steady and that officers were doing all that could be expected. It also recorded dry numbers that carried the sting of inevitability. By the evening of June 9th, American units had taken Isigny, which linked the Omaha and Utah lodgements, and had pushed inland on the sector between the Auray and the Vire. The British held Bayeux and were contesting ground north and west of Caen. The mulberry components were taking shape on the water, and the tonnage landed each day was still climbing. The general read these entries and set his jaw. He ordered a defense in depth that used every hedge and orchard as a step, with fallback positions marked and pre-registered by the artillery. He approved more night movement for supply and rotation of frontline squads by small groups so that men could sleep for a few hours under a roof. He sent a note to Corps that the division could hold if flanks did not crumble and if the Americans could be forced to pay in time rather than in ground. He did not allow himself to write the fear that sat under every calculation. Time in this battle favored the side that could feed the shore with more men, guns, fuel, and food every tide and every hour. He had no new harbor to assemble, no stream of freighters to pour out gear, no air fleet to sweep the sky. He had courage and skill in his regiments, and a countryside that helped a defender. He would have to make these count for more than they should. On June 9th, in late evening, he stood again at the eastern gate of the chateau and listened to the steady rumble that never stilled now, and he thought of the easy words he had heard in years before, when some had dismissed the American soldier as a man who would not stay in a fight that turned dirty. He remembered a report that an American destroyer on June 6th had come in so close that it scraped bottom while firing into a casemate, and how the crew kept loading and firing with a speed that a field soldier could respect. He remembered the diary entry that told of a sergeant who spoke in hard sentences at the seawall and then moved with his men through wire and smoke. He recalled the way the patrols came up the gullies on June 6th and June 7th, not in neat lines, but in knots that reformed as men fell and others took their places. He told himself the truth he would not have said a month ago. The soldiers who came out of those boats on Omaha were not cowards, not in any sense that a seasoned officer could accept. They were a stubborn lot with a method and with leaders who talked little and moved forward with a working patience that wore down a defender. He let the thought settle and made his peace with it. Respect did not change the duty before him. It sharpened it. He turned back into the map room, placed his palms on the table, and began to mark the next day's fields and lanes in a slow, careful hand. June 10th, 1944. The first light came through a broken pane in the east wing of the chateau, and General Dietrich Kraiss knew before the reports arrived that the front line had shifted again. The guns that had once been distant were now close enough to shake the shutters with each ripple of concussion. He moved through the corridor past officers who stood in small groups reading messages from the night. A runner brought word from the 9/116's regiment that American patrols had reached the outer lanes near Rubersee and that local counterattacks had failed to restore the position. The general marked the map with a short pencil stroke and asked for artillery response schedules. He was told that ammunition for the 105s was now limited to half allocation and that the main road south had been cratered by Allied bombers the previous afternoon. When he stepped into the courtyard, he could smell the wet earth and the faint metallic scent of cordite that seemed to drift inland with the morning mist. He knew the rhythm of battle days by smell as much as by sight. A sergeant from a field kitchen passed with a tray of tin cups, and the men saluted with the worn precision of those who no longer thought about the gesture. In the distance, the steady mutter of small arms rolled and faded and rolled again. The sound had changed in character from the sharp bursts of first contact to the low, continuous growl that meant lines were closing and pressure was constant. Kraiss looked toward the northwest, where the hedgerows around Trevière formed a labyrinth that neither side yet controlled. By this stage of the campaign, the German command on the Normandy front faced numbers that could no longer be bridged by courage or local skill. The Allies had landed over 326,000 men, more than 50,000 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies by June 11th. In the air, they flew nearly 15,000 sorties per day across the invasion zone. The German 7th Army reported that divisions along the coast were at half strength, with many companies reduced to fewer than 50 men. Communications between units often relied on runners because telephone lines were cut and radio frequencies ausfallen. Despite these odds, the 352 Infantry Division held positions that frustrated the American advance for several more days. Kraiss understood that the geography of Normandy was his ally for the moment. The Bocage country, with its tangled hedgerows and narrow lanes, turned every kilometer into a fortress. It denied tanks clear fields of fire and forced infantry to fight at close quarters. Yet he also knew that such terrain punished defenders once the enemy adapted. The Americans were learning fast. They were mounting guns on tanks that could blast openings through hedgerows and sending squads through gaps while machine gunners covered the flanks. Reports showed that entire fields could change hands in minutes, and that machine gun teams often fought until surrounded, then slipped away at night to new lines. On the morning of June 10th, Kraiss read a brief report from a forward observer describing American artillery as immediate and precise. Every mortar or machine gun that fired for more than a few minutes drew counterfire within seconds. The observer added that American aircraft now flew in pairs low enough to see individual soldiers and that even small convoys were attacked with rockets. The sky itself had become an enemy weapon. Kraiss drove in a staff car south toward the hamlet of Lacambe, which lay on a slight rise commanding the road toward Isigny. The village had been bombed the night before, and smoke still hung over the ruins. He walked the line with a company commander who had been awake for nearly 2 days. The man spoke quietly, pointing out where his platoons were set behind hedges and where American patrols had been sighted. They paused near a shattered wall where 2 German soldiers sat, beside a wounded comrade. The wounded man's face was pale beneath the grime, and his right arm was bound with a torn bandage. Kraiss crouched, asked his name, and told him that relief units were on the way. It was a small lie, one he told for duty's sake. The division's reserve was gone. The general stood and looked west. Beyond the orchards lay the valley where the Americans were pushing inland from Isigny, their columns thick with armor. Through binoculars he could see the flash of sunlight on steel as tanks moved along the road, followed by trucks and endless lines of men. The scale was beyond anything the German army could match. He remembered an officer from Berlin who had once called the Americans a people of machines. It had been meant as an insult. Now, watching those columns advance, Kraiss saw that it was the simple truth, and that it was the reason they would win. Machines backed by factories that never slept, by railroads that crossed a continent, by refineries that poured rivers of fuel into the engines of war. Against that, he had only courage and cleverness, which could delay but not defeat such a tide. In the following hours, the Americans widened their foothold along the Vire. Artillery units near Lacambe shelled German positions with a steady rhythm, and tanks nosed through the hedgerows one by one. In some places, the fighting was hand-to-hand. At others, German squads found themselves isolated when fields behind them fell to enemy flanking attacks. A staff officer reported that an American battalion had advanced nearly 2 kilometers in a single afternoon, a rate of movement that had seemed impossible only days earlier. By evening, The entire front from Isigny to Bayeux was alive with artillery flashes. The British 50th Division held firm along its own front, while the Canadians continued to pressure the approaches to Caen. The German counterattacks planned for June 10th never materialized. Fuel shortages and Allied bombing had reduced the mobility of armored divisions meant to support the line. Kraiss sent urgent messages requesting even a single panzer regiment to stabilize his flank, but the answer came back from Corps headquarters that no armor could move until nightfall, and even then only under strict blackout conditions. He turned to his operations officer and said quietly that if the Americans pushed again at dawn, the line could not hold in place. It would have to fall back by increments, one hedgerow at a time. The officer nodded and wrote the orders for a phased withdrawal if needed. When the sun set, the general stood at the window of the chateau and looked toward the horizon, which pulsed with the red and white glow of gunfire. He thought of the old training lectures that had mocked the American army as soft, as unable to fight without overwhelming firepower. It was true that they fought with great firepower. What the lectures had missed was that behind that firepower was endurance. He had watched them hold under punishment that would have broken less disciplined troops. He had seen captured letters describing soldiers who spoke of home, of families, and of simple reasons for fighting that were not built on fear or ideology. Their patriotism was quiet, but it burned steadily. Kraiss found himself feeling the strange respect of a professional soldier for another who did his work well. He did not speak this thought aloud, for to say it was to admit that the outcome of the campaign was already decided. He returned to the map table and traced the thin pencil lines that showed his division's shrinking front. Each line represented men he knew by name, men who would stand and die in the next field or the next village. Yet he kept drawing, because the work had to go on until there was no ground left to mark. June 11th, 1944. The dawn came with low cloud and a wind from the sea that smelled faintly of salt and smoke. In the fields south of Trevière, German infantrymen crouched in ditches filled with water and watched the horizon turn gray. The night had been restless. Flares had lifted and faded in the east, and American artillery had shelled the crossroads at La Cambe without pause for hours. At first light, the silence before a new barrage felt worse than the noise. General Dietrich Kraiss stood beside a staff car on the road near Étretat and waited for the latest reports. His division was still holding a line that curved south of the beachhead from Formigny through La Cambe and toward Rubercy, but that line was frayed in places like a worn rope. The 916 Regiment had been reduced to half strength. The 915 was stretched across too wide a front. Ammunition for the heavy guns was nearly gone. Kraiss lit a cigarette and watched smoke drift across the hood of the car. He felt the weight of exhaustion behind his eyes, yet the habit of decades kept his voice steady. When a staff captain handed him a situation map with pencil notes in the margins, he nodded without comment. The enemy had taken the bridge at Isigny, linking Omaha and Utah beaches into one continuous front. Columns of trucks were pouring through that gap. The numbers on the map told a story he did not need to read twice. By June 11th, the Allies controlled nearly 80 kilometers of coastline and a beachhead that reached 15 kilometers inland in some sectors. The Americans had joined their two landing zones. The British had secured Bayeux, and the Canadians were pressing against the Caen defenses. Allied naval fire still ruled the seaward flank. Destroyers and cruisers could move close enough to strike targets with precision, guided by spotters on the ground or by aircraft overhead. The German 7th Army, which had started the campaign with around 150,000 men in the region, was being ground down. Its reports to Army Group B described an enemy that could bring new divisions ashore faster than Germany could move a single regiment by rail. Even Field Marshal Rommel, now back from Germany, warned Berlin that the beachhead could no longer be contained. Yet orders from higher command still spoke of holding every village, every hedgerow, of counterattacks that could no longer be mounted. In Le Molay Littry, Kraiss understood what that language meant. Delay, not victory. His task now was to slow the enemy long enough for reserves to form a second line farther south. He studied the terrain like a craftsman choosing where to place the last nails in a structure about to collapse. Every small ridge, every copse of trees, every bend in the road could be used to delay the advance for an hour, maybe a day. Each hour mattered. Around midday, an air raid struck the supply column moving toward Rübersee. Kraiss watched from a distance as two fighter bombers came in low, their engines whining like saws. Bombs fell with the sound of tearing canvas. When the dust cleared, two trucks burned, and men were carrying the wounded into a ditch. The general stood still for a moment, hands clasped behind his back. He had seen such scenes too often to flinch now. But when one of the men saluted and said the driver had been his brother, Kraiss touched the man's shoulder and told him quietly to take water from the staff car. It was a small kindness, but it mattered in a world that had narrowed to pain and obedience. He walked on to a nearby command post set in the ruins of a farmhouse. The battalion commander there, a man from Bavaria with streaks of gray in his hair, showed him the defense plan for the next ridgeline. The Americans were less than 3 kilometers away. The Germans had 2 machine guns, a single light field gun, and a few dozen rifles to cover the sector. Kraiss told him to hold until nightfall, then fall back to the next hedgerow behind the orchard. He spoke quietly, his words clipped but calm. The officer nodded and returned to his men. Later that evening, Kraiss would learn that none of them came back. Beyond this small corner of the battlefield, the scale of events had outgrown anything one division could influence. In the air, Allied transport planes continued to bring supplies for the airborne divisions holding the western approaches. On the sea, new convoys arrived every tide. Within 6 days, Allied engineers had unloaded more than 100,000 tons of cargo and constructed roads, depots, and fuel lines on the sand itself. Inland, the Americans pushed toward the village of St. Lo, while the British were preparing Operation Perch, an attempt to encircle Caen with armored thrusts from both sides. The German High Command sent frantic messages for reinforcements from Brittany and from the Seine, but most formations were delayed by Allied air interdiction. Locomotives were bombed in their yards, bridges shattered, and convoys burned on the roads. For Kraiss, each new day began with fewer resources and more orders. He no longer believed in counterattacks. He believed in survival. His notebooks from those days contained only times, coordinates, and short lines like Formigny lost at 1300 or 9:15 to pull back 1 kilometer, night 11 to 12 June. Yet under those terse notes lay something no order could describe. A soldier's growing recognition that the enemy he faced had mastered both courage and calculation. As night fell on June 11th, the fields around Le Molay Littry glowed faintly with fires from distant villages. The general stood by the door of the chateau and listened to the faint sound of frogs in the ditches. For a moment, the war seemed far away. Then an American artillery shell landed 2 kilometers off, and the ground shuddered. He looked toward the west and thought of the men who had come across the sea. He remembered the faces of prisoners captured in earlier campaigns, young, careless men with soft accents who joked about baseball and home. He had believed the propaganda that they were spoiled products of an easy country. Now he knew better. They fought with a steady, relentless energy that no amount of cynicism could deny. He wondered how many of his peers had died still believing the old stories. He wondered how many more would die before they learned what he had learned on these Norman fields. When he turned back inside, he wrote one last line in his log for the day. It read, "Enemy pressure constant. Troops exhausted but unbroken. Americans advance in depth. They are not cowards." Then he closed the book and set it aside as another round of artillery rumbled across the night.